3 days ago, a dust storm swept through the Salt Lake Valley. The cloud was visible from 50 miles away. It reduced visibility across one of the fastest-growing metropolitan areas in the United States. When it cleared, a fine gray-white film coated cars, windows, and outdoor furniture across Salt Lake City and the communities to its north, Layton, Syracuse, Clearfield, Ogden. Dr. Kevin Perry, professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Utah, measured the particle concentrations. PM10 levels had reached 4 times the concentration considered safe for human health. Parents kept children inside. Health officials issued advisories. Among the contents of that dust, arsenic, lead, cadmium, sulfate, chloride compounds. All of it lifted from the exposed bed of the Great Salt Lake by the wind and carried inland across the Wasatch Front, where 2.5 million people live. This has happened between 3 and 8 times per year in recent years. But this summer is different. On May 21, 2026, Utah Governor Spencer J. Cox declared a statewide state of emergency due to extreme drought conditions, citing the lowest snowpack ever recorded in Utah's history. And as of this morning, the Great Salt Lake stands at approximately 4,191 feet above sea level, 3 feet above the all-time record low of 4,188.5 feet set in November of 2022. Scientists at the University of Utah and at the Heal Utah Environmental Organization say the lake may drop below that record before the first autumn storms bring relief. And the National Geographic Society concluded in a May 2026 investigation that if the current trajectory continues, the lake could dry out completely by the end of the decade. Researchers who study the Great Salt Lake have taken to calling its potential disappearance an environmental nuclear bomb. To understand what that phrase means, you have to understand what the Great Salt Lake actually is and what it does. The lake is a remnant of Lake Bonneville, a vast body of water that covered much of Utah, Nevada, and Idaho during the last ice age. At its maximum extent, approximately 16,000 years ago, Lake Bonneville reached the size of Lake Michigan. What remains today is its shallow, highly saline remnant, sitting at the low point of the Great Basin in northern Utah. The Great Salt Lake is a terminal lake. It has no outlet to the ocean. Water flows in from rivers and snowmelt from the Wasatch Mountains. It leaves only through evaporation. That single characteristic determines everything about how the lake responds to changes in supply. Small reductions in inflow produce large reductions in water level, because there is no other way for excess water to leave. The lake's historical level has ranged from a high of approximately 4,212 feet in the late 19th century to the 2022 record low of 4,188.5 feet. Across that range, everything changes. The lake's surface area, its salinity, the viability of its brine shrimp population, the lake effect snow it generates for the Wasatch ski resorts, and the amount of lake bed exposed to wind. The lake is currently at 4,191 feet. The record is 3 feet below. The crisis that produced the current trajectory began with snow, or rather, the absence of it. Utah's snowpack is the primary mechanism by which the mountains store winter precipitation and release it slowly through spring and early summer into the rivers that feed the lake. By March 7, 2026, Utah's snowpack had fallen to less than half the typical state average, the lowest ever recorded. When Governor Cox declared the emergency on May 21st, he cited accelerating drought across the entire state. The hydrology of the Great Salt Lake watershed follows that drought with a delay of months. The worst of its effects arrive in summer and fall when the lake level is lowest and the dust hazard is highest. Utah is living through that delay right now. The dust that fell on Salt Lake City this week came from the exposed lakebed. As water levels drop, the lake retreats and the sediment it leaves behind, dry, fine-grained, mineral-rich from decades of industrial and agricultural runoff, becomes vulnerable to wind. The most dangerous dust hotspots are in the lakes Farmington Bay and Bear River Bay, where rivers deposit fine sediments that, once dry, are easily lifted by cold fronts. They can carry particles 50 miles or more, and they carry everything that has accumulated on that lakebed over the past century of industrial activity in northern Utah. Arsenic at concentrations that make it one of the 13 most concerning contaminants in the exposed sediment, alongside lead, cadmium, and mercury from a history of copper mining, smelting, and agricultural chemical use. Dr. Perry is explicit about what those concentrations mean in practice. It doesn't matter what the dust is made out of, he has said. If those PM10 concentrations are high enough, it can cause immediate respiratory problems for people. Those problems include emergency room admissions, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory distress, and premature mortality. For chronic exposure at lower concentrations, researchers at Brigham Young University have linked the lake's dust to potential developmental defects in children, cognitive impairment, and elevated cancer risk. More than 800 square miles of lakebed are currently exposed to wind erosion. There is a historical comparison that haunts every conversation about the Great Salt Lake's future. In the 1920s, the city of Los Angeles diverted the water of the Owens River from Owens Lake in California's high desert east of the Sierra Nevada. The lake dried completely. The dry lakebed, laced with arsenic, cadmium, and nickel, became the single largest source of particulate dust pollution in the United States for decades. Controlling it has cost Los Angeles ratepayers more than $2.5 billion, and the management costs continue indefinitely. The Great Salt Lake's exposed lakebed is already more than 16 times the size of Owens Lake. If the lake dries completely, dust suppression could cost hundreds of millions of dollars annually, before accounting for the health costs to 2.5 million people downwind. Understanding why the lake is disappearing requires understanding how a terminal lake dies, which is different from how rivers or groundwater aquifers respond to drought. Agriculture accounts for approximately 65% of the human-caused water depletions in the Great Salt Lake watershed. Municipal and industrial use accounts for roughly 23%, with urban outdoor watering, lawns, and landscaping representing a larger share of that figure than previously recognized. Between the rivers that carry this diverted water to crops and cities and the lake that has no outlet, every acre-foot removed from the watershed is an acre-foot that cannot replace what evaporates. When inflow drops, the lake's surface area and volume decrease. The lake does not stabilize at a lower level. It continues to fall, and as it falls, it exposes more lakebed, which generates more dust, which darkens the mountain snowpack when it lands there, which causes the snow to absorb more solar energy and melt faster, which reduces the runoff available to refill the lake. This is the self-reinforcing spiral that scientists describe when they use the phrase environmental nuclear bomb. The ecological collapse of the Great Salt Lake would not be limited to dust. The lake supports a global food supply chain that most of the people who depend on it have never heard of. Brine shrimp, the tiny crustaceans that thrive in the lake's saline waters, are harvested and processed into aquaculture feed, supplying approximately 40 to 50% of the world's aquaculture industry. Beyond the brine shrimp, the lake is a critical stopover for an estimated 10 million migratory birds on the Pacific Flyway. If the brine shrimp population collapses under increasing salinity, as it did in the lake's North Arm years ago, those birds lose their primary food source at a critical moment in their migration. Salt Lake City is also scheduled to host the 2030 Winter Olympics. The bid's centerpiece is the Wasatch Mountains' legendary snowpack, marketed as the greatest snow on Earth. That snowpack depends in part on lake effect moisture from the Great Salt Lake. Less lake means less snow. The response underway is substantial by any measure. A $815 million water reclamation facility is opening this summer at Farmington Bay. The federal government has channeled approximately $1 billion in conservation aid toward the watershed. Utah's legislature has passed water leasing reforms and groundwater protection measures. Between 2021 and 2025, approximately 400,000 acre-feet of water were dedicated to the lake through conservation programs. Paul Brooks, a hydrologist at the University of Utah, summed up the situation plainly. We've really reached a tipping point. Scientists who study terminal lakes say the fundamental problem with the recovery effort is speed. None of it can compensate fast enough for the deficit created by the lowest snowpack in recorded history. The interventions are real and will matter, but they are fighting the current trajectory 1 acre-foot at a time. There are 3 numbers that scientists and water managers are watching as the 2026 summer season unfolds. The first is the USGS Saltair gauge reading. As of this week, 4,191 feet. The 2022 record is 4,188.5 feet. The question is whether the lake breaks through that record before autumn precipitation begins to refill it. The second is the first annual data from Utah's new Dust Observation and Research Network. UDORN has been expanding its monitoring stations across the lakebed perimeter. For the first time, researchers will have data detailed enough to answer the question Dr. Perry has been asked for 5 years. Is the dust getting worse? The data this year will start building the trend record that has not previously existed. The third is the brine shrimp population survey. Conducted annually across the lake's remaining water, it tracks the population that supports both the global aquaculture industry and the 10 million birds on the Pacific Flyway. In 2022, the population dropped significantly as salinity rose. The 2026 survey will determine whether any recovery has been possible under current conditions or whether the ecological collapse is continuing into the lake's central and southern arms. 3 feet above the all-time record, the lowest snowpack in the state's history, a dust storm 3 days ago, and 2.5 million people who, the next time the wind picks up, will be breathing what the Great Salt Lake used to be. Subscribe to stay ahead of what's coming.